All right, so today we're going to be looking at a pretty complex topic.
Yeah.
We're going to be examining Benjamin Netanyahu's views.
Interesting.
So we're going to be using excerpts from Netanyahu's own book to kind of get a sense of where he's coming from.
Okay.
So get ready for a deep dive into history, security concerns,
Wow.
economic proposals, international relations. So to start off, let's look at some of Netanyahu's historical claims.
Okay.
He really puts a lot of emphasis on the continuous Jewish presence in Palestine, even under like Roman and Byzantine rule. And he uses this continuous presence to support the Jewish claim to the land,
Okay.
even drawing an analogy to like continuous land ownership. He even brings up the Uganda Plan controversy to highlight this like
Right.
unwavering commitment to the land of Israel.
That's a key point, though. I mean, it really raises the question of,
Yeah.
while that historical presence is undeniable, how do Palestinians reconcile these claims with their own narrative?
Right.
You know, things like the Balfour Declaration and
Yeah.
subsequent British policies had a huge impact on displacement and
Yeah.
dispossession of Palestinians. And over time, the territory that was allocated for a Jewish national home shrunk.
Yeah.
Transjordan was excluded in 1922. And then the 1948 war resulted in just this massive refugee crisis.
Right.
I mean, these events are central to the Palestinian collective memory.
Absolutely.
And it really shapes how they understand historical justice.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's such a critical point
Yeah.
because Netanyahu talks about, Jewish revolts against Roman rule and points to places like Pekian and Shafangam where Jewish communities have lived for centuries.
Right.
But then how does that fit with the Palestinian experience of displacement and loss of their land?
Yeah, exactly.
Imagine being told that this land has always belonged to someone else.
Yeah.
When your family has lived there for generations.
That feeling, that sense of loss and dispossession,
Right.
that's absolutely central to the Palestinian experience.
Yes.
I mean, we have to remember that when Netanyahu talks about the 1948 war as, this successful defense against Arab attacks,
Yeah.
Palestinians remember it as the Nakba,
Right.
an catastrophe that led to their forced displacement and loss of their homeland.
Right.
And this difference in interpretation and how they view this pivotal moment in history, it has huge implications for how each side approaches peace and compromise.
Yeah, it's almost like they're speaking two different languages,
Is.
even when they're using the same words.
Totally.
And this difference in perspective really sets the stage for how each side views this critical issue of security measures.
Oh.
But then how do Palestinians experience these very security measures
Right.
that are put in place to address those fears?
Yeah, that's a good question because from the Palestinian perspective, those security measures often feel like oppression.
Right.
Israeli settlements in the West Bank,
Right.
which Netanyahu sees as this natural extension of Jewish presence,
Right.
are viewed by Palestinians as a direct threat to their future statehood.
Yeah.
Imagine looking out your window and seeing settlements expanding,
Right.
taking more and more of the land that you consider your own.
It's a really stark contrast, right?
Yeah.
Netanyahu highlights the expansion of Ariel, which is a large Jewish settlement in the West Bank.
Yes.
With, shopping malls and universities and
Right.
even an avenue named after George Bush.
Wow.
But for Palestinians, that very expansion represents the encroachment on their land
Right.
and the diminishing possibility of a viable Palestinian state.
Exactly. And it's not just the settlements.
Yeah.
For Palestinians living under Israeli military administration,
Yeah.
means navigating a system of checkpoints and restrictions on movement
Yeah.
and constant security checks. I mean,
Right.
this impacts every single aspect of their lives. Their
Right.
ability to work, to go to school, to visit family, to access a medical care.
Right.
It's a constant daily reminder of their lack of freedom and self-determination.
Yeah, and Netanyahu acknowledges these measures,
Right.
but argues that they're necessary to prevent terrorism and ensure Israel's survival. But how do Palestinians reconcile this need for security with their own desire for freedom and dignity?
Right.
And I think this is where we need to talk about the Intifada.
Yes, the Intifada. It's a real turning point in this narrative. I mean, Netanyahu views it as a wave of violence and terror.
Yeah.
But for many Palestinians, it was an act of resistance against the occupation.
Right.
This really encapsulates the vast difference in perspective, you know?
Yeah.
What one side sees as self-defense, the other sees as oppression. Yeah, and that brings us to Netanyahu's economic proposals, which he believes can be a path towards peace.
Right. He talks about regional cooperation, water sharing, desalination projects involving Jordan and Saudi Arabia.
Right. And on the surface, it sounds promising.
Yeah, it does.
It does. But, you know, a lot of Palestinians are skeptical of these proposals.
Okay.
They argue that any attempt at economic peace, without addressing the core political and security issues at the heart of the conflict, is just not going to work.
Right. So it's like
trying to build a house on a foundation that's constantly shifting and cracking.
So it's like offering someone a fancy car when they don't even have a road to drive on.
Exactly. Yeah. And we can't ignore the significant economic disparities between Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah.
You know, Palestinians face major challenges in accessing resources and opportunity.
Right.
Restrictions on movement and trade severely hinder their economic development.
Yeah.
You know, Netanyahu acknowledges this wage gap between Arab workers in Haifa and Nablus.
Right.
But from a Palestinian perspective, that gap is a symptom of a system that's inherently unequal. And while this vision of economic cooperation might seem appealing, Palestinians want genuine economic independence and self-sufficiency as part of their statehood aspirations.
Yeah.
They don't want to be reliant on Israel or any other country for their economic well-being.
Absolutely. And that desire for self-determination is a thread that runs through, I think, the Palestinian perspective on all of these issues.
Totally.
And it becomes even more apparent when we examine Netanyahu's views on the role of the international community in this conflict.
Absolutely.
So Netanyahu's very critical of international organizations like the United Nations.
Yeah.
He sees them as being biased against Israel.
Right.
And he brings up the Zionism is racism resolution as a prime example. He believes that Israel needs to cultivate strong alliances, like its relationship with the U.S., and rely on its own strength rather than seeking international support.
Yeah.
You know, he's arguing that Israel cannot afford to be passive in the face of international pressure.
Right.
So again, we see these two starkly contrasting interpretations of the same events.
Absolutely.
The UN that Netanyahu sees as hostile is the same UN that Palestinians view as a potential source of support and validation.
Right.
It all circles back to that fundamental question of compromise.
Yeah. It's a complex challenge.
It is.
That demands a deep understanding of both sides' narratives.
Right.
And a willingness to engage with those narratives in a meaningful and empathetic way.
Absolutely.
I mean, peace can't be built on a foundation of fear and resentment.
Right.
It requires acknowledging the pain and suffering on both sides and working towards a future where healing and reconciliation can begin.
That's a really powerful thought.
Okay.
He argues that coddling dictators only perpetuate cycles of violence and oppression, emphasizing that we can't afford to be passive in the face of tyranny.
Right.
While this is a powerful argument,
Yeah.
I wonder how it's perceived by Palestinians.
That's an important question.
Yeah.
Because from a Palestinian perspective, this push for democratization might feel like yet another form of Western intervention.
Right.
An attempt to impose a specific political system without understanding the nuances of the region.
Yeah.
Remember, self-determination is of paramount importance to Palestinians.
Yes.
They want the right to choose their own path,
Right.
their own leaders, their own destiny.
It does feel a bit like saying,
Yeah.
we know what's best for you,
Right.
without truly giving them the space to determine their own future.
Yeah.
And it all circles back to that fundamental right to self-determination.
Exactly.
If Palestinians feel like that right is being denied, if their voices aren't being heard,
Yes,
is that understanding the Palestinian perspective is essential
it is.
if we truly want to grasp the complexities of this conflict.